Well, Michael Liberzon, thanks for being on the Marginal Gains podcast. Folks, if you haven't heard of the Endurance Innovation podcast, I would really encourage you to go check it out. That's where I found Michael. Michael, your podcast came to me via Adam Kieran. It's funny how this world works, right? Adam, Zero Friction Cycling, you've had him on. He told me about your show, and I went and started checking out, and I discovered a pattern right away, and that was a lot of aero talk. And I tell you folks, the Marginal Gains folks out there listening right now, if you're into the CDA stuff, you've got to go check out the Endurance Innovation podcast, because Michael and Andrew, the hosts of that podcast, eat up the aero talk, and in particular Aerometers, which is why I've had Michael on the show. So Michael, again, thanks for being on the show. Do you know how many CDA aero focus shows you've done so far? Do you have any type of count on that?
Well, Hadi, first of all, thank you so much for having me on. It's an honor. I've been following, obviously, what you folks at Silka and the Marginal Gains podcast do, and yeah, it's a real thrill to be here. But now you've put me on the spot, because I don't. I know in terms of companies that make a physical product that you can strap on your bike and go out and do some aero testing. Off the top of my head, we've probably done 5, I want to say, and there's one that we just recorded that isn't up yet. So let's call it an even half dozen.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And then plus there's other just topics where you guys talk CDA about what athletes can do about aerodynamics, and then a whole suite of other topics. You know, Michael, one thing I'll have to say is, as somebody, I'm just a pure cyclist. I've not done any triathlon in my life. I can't swim worth a damn. I'm an okay runner, so I just kind of stay away. But I'll say this about the triathlete community, and you're a triathlete coach, obviously, is that when I listen to triathletes or outlets and content about triathlons, I mean, I learn tons about it. And do you have any, I mean, what's the insight there? It seems to me that triathletes, since they are these solo efforts, they're solo athletes, they're very much focused on themselves and what they have to do. They really do have to pay attention to all these little things. Is that kind of the nature of the beast with the triathlete?
Yeah, certainly. And I think the sport definitely attracts those who are analytically minded. Maybe, I don't want to say more than cycling does, but certainly to a great extent. And one of the reasons behind this, Hadi, I think, is that triathlon is much less encumbered by regulations. Right, so there's no, we do have ITU rules, and we have World Triathlon or Ironman rules that we have to follow, but they are much less stringent than UCI. So there is, I guess the barrier to innovation is much lower, right? So it's easier to do things that are unthinkable under let's say UCI regulations. So I think that lower barrier to entry makes it a better hotbed sometimes for innovation, and then sometimes technology ends up trickling down into cycling. But that would be probably the biggest reason.
Except in some events, you guys have this bizarre no drafting rule, which drives up cyclists to realize, what? No drafting?
It makes no sense. Yeah, we actually had we did an interview with a Kiwi brand that is designing a sensor that is meant to defeat drafting, right? So it basically radios officials through this really complicated system to let them know when folks are drafting and breaking the rules. So there's innovation in the space of defeating drafting as well.
Yikes. Don't like that.
Yep.
Come on now. Well, we are going to talk about Aerometers here, which is why I invited Michael on the show. Again, folks, Endurance Innovation Podcast. They have a slew of shows out about aerodynamics and specifically about Aerometers. You guys have done some really great work here. And Michael, what we're going to do here with Michael is he's going to offer us a real overview on what's going on in this area of Aerometers. And I have a little story to kick this off with, Michael, and that is going back to 2016 at Interbike. I was there covering the event for Triathlete Magazine. That's kind of funny. I told you I'm not a triathlete, but there I was. I was hired by Triathlete as a contractor to cover some stuff for them for their magazine. And one of the things I went and covered for them was this rollout by Argon. It was a concept bike. I don't remember the exact name of it, but the concept bike, what they were plugging about it and promoting about it was it did real-time CDA. It had 22 sensors all over it. And the idea was that this bike would be able to give you some idea of your aerodynamics in real time, which I thought was cool. And in addition to that, Argon also talked up a nose cone that could be attached to any bike. And they, in fact, hope to have this nose cone out by 2018. Again, the idea was real-time CDA. Now, this product may be available somewhere, but it's certainly hard to find in your local bike shop or online, say at Competitive Cyclists. Like I've since 2016, I've not been able to see. Now, I'm not actively looking for it, but like this product just isn't out there that I'm aware of, or maybe it is, and that's why we have Michael on. So what's happened, Michael, since 2016? Like, where do we stand now with these real-time CDA products?
So I wasn't at Interbike, unfortunately, Hadi, but I did read that article. Maybe it was in Triathlon, maybe it was in any number of the other outlets that were covering that show. Yeah, that bike was wild, and what they were trying to do was super interesting. And of course, being the engineering nerd, cyclist, triathlete that I was very interested in being able to quantify this. This last thing that we couldn't figure out. We had pretty good power meters by that time. We could measure all sorts of things about our own physiology with heart rate meters. There was near infrared stuff for muscle oxygenation. There was all sorts of innovation happening, but aerodynamics and for those of us who were paying attention, we knew that aero was a big deal. There was no way to quantify it. Basically, I always, and I don't think I coined this. I'm sure I stole this from somebody, but all we had was the slow twitch wind tunnel, right? So, which is basically you post your photo on slow twitch and you would say, is this faster or is this faster? And then basically that's as far as you could get. And then maybe there were some fitters who knew what they were doing, but and then if you had a lot of money, you could go to a wind tunnel. But there was no way for somebody like me, somebody who is a coach and a recreational athlete, to get a sense of what my aerodynamics, where my aerodynamic drag was, and how to improve it. So I was super excited about this product, and I would definitely classify myself as an early adopter because I sat down with the folks from Argon. And this was a spin-off that they'd created, a spin-off company called Noshio. And they were called Noshio Connect in the first place. Now I think they just go by Noshio. And they came to the Milton Velodrome, which is our local track, in I think it was spring or summer of 2018. And I bought one of these things. So they were, the way they were selling them back then was they had this, this big rollout. And if you purchased one, they would take you to the track. We didn't actually ride bikes, but they rented a conference room at the track where they sat us all down, I think like 4 or 5 of us, and a bunch of them were industry people. And they gave us our Noshio Aerometers, and then they showed us how to use it in a boardroom, right? And so I remember doing that, and that was a fascinating experience. So it is available, and it's still available, and I'm pretty sure you can buy them online on. I believe the website is noshio.ai. Then, of course, I got mine and I strapped it on my bike, and then I went aero testing. And then the first thing I realized was like, whoa, this does not make sense. These numbers don't quite add up, or like this is not as straightforward as I thought. And not to knock Noshio at all, because they actually had an amazing support team behind them. And so I was able to, email their engineers, and their engineers would reply to me. They would look at my files and they would tell me what it was that I messed up in that test. And we're like, oh, there were some cars passing you here. And oh, on this test, you went under a tunnel. And tunnels are tricky. Or here you were, I don't know, the pavement wasn't good. So I was messing it up in a lot of ways, and they were great and very generous with their time in supporting me and helping me make sense of what I was seeing. But I guess, does that answer your question? So that was the genesis of these devices and my first experience with one of them.
Uh-huh. So Noshio was the nose cone that came out following that announcement, and it's still out there now, correct?
Yes, it is. I think it's in its, I want to say its second version or maybe even third. But yes, it is definitely a commercial product. I know bike shops in Toronto that sell them, so they are available in some shops, and certainly you can buy one online.
Mm-hmm. And so what's followed up? Have there been other companies or products that have made it to market with an aerometer that the public can use?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So this was, as you said, 2018 that they actually did come to market. And since then, as far as commercial aerometers, there aren't many. So there's so Noshio is an Argon spinoff. They're a company out of Quebec in Canada. There's another Canadian company out of Calgary called Aerolab. We've had them on the show. So I haven't used their device, and their sort of market play was to position this not as an end user device that anyone can strap onto their bike, but more for the use of coaches and teams and aero fitters. Mm-hmm. So their business model is a little bit different. So I haven't had the chance to use it, but they are out there, and if you are a fitter or a coach or a sports scientist, you can get your hands on one of these. And I think they've been available for the last, I want to say, 12 or maybe 18 months.
Mm-hmm. And then, as anybody who pays attention to your show knows, there's a number of companies that have got stuff on the drawing board or that are prototypes so far, correct?
Yeah, that's right. So we just had another Canadian company, and Andrew, my co-host, makes this joke that there must be something in the water. So there's another Canadian company called Ghibli, and they have a sensor that is the G10 sensor that is pretty close. I think they have, the way they explained it to us when they came on and talked to us, is that the sensor is ready to go. They're still, adding features and developing it, but the chip shortage that sort of affected a lot of the electronics market in the last 2 years sort of delayed their release, but they are otherwise quite close to having a commercial product. And this one is intended for the end user, so for the average cyclist or triathlete to strap onto his or her bike.
Mm-hmm. So at least we do have some progress. I mean, it's better than I guess I thought or I believed. But clearly, there must be something that is tripping up these companies, that is keeping them from producing these in a massive scale so that they are more widely adopted. What do you see right now as the big hurdles for Aerometers?
Well, I mean, to put it to kind of give you a flippant reply, Hadi, it's aero testing in the field is really hard. So that's that would be the lead here. But and the reason that it's hard, and if you'll allow me, I want to spend maybe 2-3 minutes talking about why it's hard, just laying the groundwork for this. So anyone who's ridden a bike understands that you put power into the pedals to go forward, and then there's a bunch of things that are slowing you down and preventing you from going as fast as you would otherwise like. So there are 4 categories of things, right? So the first would be obvious. The first obvious one is gravity. Obviously, when you're going up a hill, you have to work hard to add potential energy to you plus the bike, the rider bike system to go up that hill. Then you reap the rewards when you go back down the hill. But going up a hill is hard, as anyone knows. So that's a really big one. So going up hills, so adding potential energy, that's one. Acceleration, so whenever your speed changes, that's energy that you have to add to the system again. That's your kinetic energy, if you like. And then those are kind of the energy system, the energy that you can store in your bike rider system. And then the other 3 components are all drag. So they're all, things that rob you of energy. So the first one is rolling resistance, which I know you guys have covered at length. So I will leave it at that. It's not super straightforward, but it is something that's important to understand. The second one is drivetrain drag, and thank you, Adam, for connecting us. He is he's the expert there. But depending on how well your drivetrain is maintained and what choice of lube you're using, there's quite a bit of difference in losses there. And then the final one, the fifth one, I know I said 4, I miscounted. There are 5. The fifth one is aerodynamic drag. And so depending on the situation, but with reasonable tires on a flat bit of ground at let's say 35, 40, 45 kilometers an hour, kind of, let's say 25 miles an hour, sort of for your U.S. listeners, speed, aero drag can easily contribute, 75, 80% of your total loss, right? So unless you're going up a big hill or unless you're rapidly accelerating. So aero drag is a big deal. But now if we think about what these devices that we want to strap onto our bike and have them show us a number that means something to us, what these devices must be good at, or what the problem they're trying to solve is they're trying to tease out that aerodynamic drag number from all the other numbers, okay, from the other 4 numbers. So in order to do a good job of giving you an aero drag number, you need to have a very, very good way of calculating, or at least, or no, measuring, or at least calculating those other 4 things. So that makes it very tricky. And I'll give you one example. There's lots of examples, but one example, for example, is the work that you have to do to overcome gravity, right? So the work you have to do to go up a hill is a huge component when that hill is there, unless you're riding on perfectly flat ground. So in order to get a really good sense of how much energy you're putting into the system to go up a hill, you need extremely precise altimetry data, right? So you need to know how high you are and how quickly that is changing, how much energy you're adding in. And altimeters are not that good. There's a lot of issues with let's say even really good barometric altimeters that we have on our head units or on our watches. And there's some really creative ideas that folks who are developing these devices are using in using IMUs to calibrate altimeters and altimeters to calibrate IMUs, and using those systems together to get a really accurate elevation data. But we're not there yet. There's nothing out there right now that I'm aware of that does an amazing job at getting your elevation profile exactly right. And so that's an example of a challenge. There's similar challenges to acceleration. So, for example, GPS signals, and I know Ghibli doesn't agree with me on this, but from my understanding, your GPS data, which is how you get your speed normally on your head unit, it lags, and it lags enough that if you're accelerating and decelerating as you're doing your ride or as you're doing your aero test, that is going to affect your aerodynamic drag calculation, because again, acceleration was one of those buckets of energy that contribute to our whole system. So it makes it harder to tease out the aero drag if you can't get very, very accurate data from all of these other sensors. Does that make sense?
Oh, totally. Now, rolling resistance. How do we calculate that?
Rolling resistance. So there's some, again, really, really interesting, and I should really let somebody who knows this better speak to it, but there's some really interesting ways to tease out rolling resistance, and it has to do with the fact that the power to overcome aero drag is proportional to the velocity cubed. But the power to overcome rolling resistance, I believe, is just proportional to the velocity. So the fact that there is a different exponent relationship between those two things, that's how you can sometimes tease out rolling resistance. Because as far as I know, there's no device out there that measures rolling resistance. So the way that most of these companies solve this problem is that you just plug in a flat value. So you'll say, okay, well, I've got good tires, and I'm riding on smooth tarmac, 0.04. 0.004. That's the number I'm just going to plug in.
And as long as the user is consistently using the same air pressure and same tires and wheels, can that be eliminated as a variable?
So mostly, but there's a topic that I'm not fully landed, that I don't have my head fully wrapped around, because I've heard folks who I really trust say opposing things, and that is how much does temperature play a role. And here's what I mean. So let's say you're doing aero testing, right? And you start in the morning, and it's chilly, and the sun's just coming up, and then by the time you're doing your last handful of tests, it's maybe 10 or 11 o'clock, and the sun is beaming down, and it's warming up the asphalt, and the temperature in your tires, the air in your tires is actually getting warmer, and so that might change the tire pressure a little bit. So you could use something like a live, air pressure meter. Something that I think SRAM's got one of these things, and you could use that as another input. But then you're coming to the problem where if you have so basically, in order to do this kind of testing, you need you unlike a power meter where you're just measuring power from one sensor, right, from well, really two sensors, from strain gauges and from something that's giving you your RPMs. In an aero sensor, in a system here, you need to know your power, you need to know your altimeter, your altitude, you need to know your speed. Maybe you have a tire pressure sensor, and all of these sensors come with errors. And then once you start stacking those errors, then the accuracy of your aero data is really suspect now, because you could easily have errors that stack and in a certain way where you're looking for accuracy that in let's say testing helmets, right? So where you may have a difference of accuracy where you may have a real world difference of 2 to 3 or 4 watts. When you start stacking all of these instrumental errors, you get errors that are much bigger than that. So you will end up with problems where your instrument error can obscure what you're actually trying to measure. Another way of saying that is your noise level is so high that you cannot see the signal for all that noise.
And then drivetrain, we know the careful athlete could at least keep this variable to a minimum by going out every time they're using some type of real-time CDA with a absolutely clean and up-to-date drivetrain, and a drivetrain that's properly lubed. Am I correct on that, or are there wide variables there?
No, I think you're spot on, Hadi. I think drivetrain is probably the least the least of the confounding variables here. The biggest ones, as I said, are elevation, and I would also argue speed is an important one too, and that's. Not even considering other factors when you're aero testing, but elevation's probably the number one source of error for aero testing.
Okay, let's circle back then to those two bigger variables. If I'm on a perfectly flat course and or a closed circuit, can I do something about that gravity factor?
Absolutely, yes. The answer is yes. So if you're doing, that's why a lot of so here's where I think it's important to make the distinction between testing with an aerometer, with an aero sensor, versus getting something like what some brands have called live CDA, right? So the promise of live CDA is it's like the utopia of cycling aerodynamics, right? You strap this thing on, you start pedaling, and it gives you a CDA value, and that's your real CDA value right now. So where we stand currently, there's nothing even close on the market that is going to do that for you. So that is maybe that's a long-term sort of dream for us, but right now that does not exist. There are devices that you can use for testing, however. So testing is probably where I would, certainly that's where I have most of my experience, and that's where we can spend some time talking about it.
And before we get beyond all the variables here, if I do a speed sensor, does that eliminate or at least close the bigger gap with acceleration?
Absolutely, yeah. And so that's another factor that most systems out there that I'm familiar with will use a speed sensor, so that you have an accurate. So that it's an instantaneous trigger for acceleration. Of course, then with a speed sensor, you still have to do the right things. So you have to roll out your wheel and measure the circumference of your wheel correctly. You can't just use a table, because as you folks no doubt have talked about, wheels inflate differently on different tires at different pressures, and tires inflate differently on different wheels, and so the circumference of a tire may be off by a little bit, and that's enough to throw off your math if you haven't measured it correctly. So that's another potential source of error as well.
So again, it sounds like at best what we have right now are a couple of products out there that do and you give it the grade, a job at, I don't know how good of a job, on a testing level, not on a real-time racing level.
Yes. Yeah, so the real-time racing level, I think, is we're not close right now. At least I'm not aware of a device that's out there. Now, there are a few that are kind of being cooked up right now, which I'm super excited about. But nothing that is currently available that I've seen or I've used myself, or I've had folks who I trust use, that get anywhere near live kind of CDA. But for testing, yeah, we can definitely there's definitely devices or systems out there that when the test is set up correctly, can absolutely give us very useful information.
What kind of product are we talking about here as far as, installation, putting on our bike? Are these large devices? Are they discrete? Can you tuck them under a head unit, or do they make themselves known?
No, they've got some pretty good industrial design behind them, so they look pretty sleek. The Noshio is the size of kind of like I would say like an average to large cycling light, and it uses a GoPro mount. It just tucks in under your head unit, like you said. So it's pretty elegant. It's designed to be aerodynamically neutral. So is the Ghibli product. So is the Aerolab product. They're all pretty small. They don't weigh very much, and they are meant to be mounted below the head unit. At least all the ones that I've seen.
Yeah, because we talked a lot about, more sensors. I mean, that's the thing I think a lot of cyclists are trying to get away from, at least regular road cyclists. Like, we're trying to pare down that stuff. Mm-hmm. Here we're talking about, Argon talked about 22 sensors on a bike. I don't know what Noshio and Aerolab have got going for them, but it doesn't exactly make for a clean look. When we're, in an age where we're trying to hide cables and tuck everything away, adding more sensors, would seem to complicate the user experience, maybe?
You're spot on. So I think if your listeners take anything away from this, I think it's the understanding that aero testing is not easy. It's not, at least today, right? So there are some really smart people making really brilliant devices and ecosystems, I would even say, that are changing that, and the product range is evolving all the time. But today it is a fairly involved process. So it's not, if anyone tells you that it's an easy thing to do, they're trying to sell you, I think, a load of goods, would be my opinion.
What are we talking about for cost right now? Like, what are some of these products costing folks who do want to jump into it?
Yeah, so I think the Noshio, it's been a little while since I've checked. I think there were $599, I believe, was the cost for it. I think the Ghibli sensor is a little bit more than that. I want to say it's either $799 or $899. So it's a cost. It's kind of the cost of a power meter, sort of in that ballpark. But and then there are ones that are coming out probably in this year or next year that I don't know the costs on yet, of course.
And what's the software like these days? The software, is it meant for the user or the engineer?
That's a great question. So I think at this point it's worth introducing a company that doesn't even use a device that I actually have quite a bit of experience with, and that's Aerotune out of Germany. So they are. We should definitely talk about them. But the reason I mention them here is because their interface and user experience is actually probably the best of the ones that I've used. So that system is designed for the end user. You do not need to understand. You do not need to have a very deep understanding of what's going on aerodynamically. The initial Noshio product, it required you to use basically do the Chung method in Golden Cheetah at the end of the day in order to get good results from it. So you would have to take the data from the Noshio device or from your head unit, import it into Golden Cheetah, and then perform the virtual elevation analysis in order to get your CDA values. Since then, they've streamlined it, and now all of that happens on your phone. So you carry your phone with you, which talks to your head unit, pulls the data from the head unit, and then at the end of a test ride, you can look at your phone and you will get a CDA value. The Aerotune product displays a CDA value directly on your head unit. So it's a Garmin app that they have through Connect IQ.
And for Noshio and Aerolab and Ghibli and all the other folks out there who are trying to develop these products, what is their big need? Is it processing? Are they looking for a chip that will do the right thing for them, or is it on the software side? Is that their big hang-up?
Well, so remember when I was talking about all the challenges of getting this technology to work? Is basically you need to very accurately measure or calculate several variables, and you need to be able to filter for things that don't make sense. As an example, let's say you're riding along and a car passes you. Okay, and then all of a sudden you have it feels like you're going a lot faster because we've all drafted cars or other cyclists, so we know when a car passes you get there's a gust of wind that blows you to the side a little bit, depending on the size of the car. But then for a little moment, you have a reduction in your apparent CDA. So one of the challenges in these, but that's obviously has nothing to do with you. That just has, that's just the artifact of the car passing you. So one of the challenges is being able to filter out these artifacts, right? Is knowing when the data doesn't make sense for one reason or another, or you tapped on the brakes, right? So, or you crested a hill or something like that. There's all sorts of scenarios. Maybe you hit a pothole. All sorts of scenarios where the clean aero data doesn't make sense, and the system needs to make sense of that data, and that is complicated. So that is more of a software issue than a hardware one, I think. I think hardware has come a really long way, and it's getting all of the different chips and sensors to work together, and maybe even to check the other ones, if that makes sense. So one of the examples that I gave earlier was you can use an IMU, which is like one of those, I think, like a Leomo type product, which senses position in 3 dimensions, or like your phone has these things as well. So, for example, you can use an IMU to error check your barometric altimeter, because let's say this IMU, if it's mounted inside the device and it's now pointing upwards, which would suggest you're climbing, but your barometric altimeter is not reading your elevation as going up, then something is going on. So there are ways for these devices, and again through smart software engineering, to improve the outcome. And then the other thing I'll say too, Hadi, is that it's a user friendliness question, because of all of these things that I've listed. You really have to set up the experiment. If we're just talking about testing now, you have to set up the test correctly to get good data out of it. And that presents its own limitations, right? So, for example, with AeroTune, the system that I have the most experience with, to get good data, you need a flat stretch of road with minimal elevation, reasonably good pavement, minimal traffic. And you want it to be, and they're constantly evolving this, but you want it to be at least 12 to 1,400 meters long, so almost a mile long, without any interruptions, without any lights, without any stop signs. And so, depending where you live, for example, I live in a major city, that's impossible to find. So I have to drive pretty far out of Toronto in order to find a stretch of road like that. And in some places where it's mountainous terrain, you're not going to find that at all. So right now, the setting up the experiment, or the test correctly, is challenging. So the real challenge which is what some of these like the Aerolabs and the Ghiblis of the world, they're making these claims that you can test anywhere, which is that's the dream. But I haven't seen that. I haven't seen that borne out yet.
Yeah. Now, regarding these products that you, or no-show, which you've tried, or any of them which you've heard about, I mean, obviously they can't make suggestions, or can they? Can they say, we put on a better helmet? That's still up to the user, right? I mean, the user has to go, okay, I'm going to try a new helmet and test. Is that how they all currently work? Yeah,
you're spot on. That's the other kind of the other side of the difficulty coin is the now what question, right? So, and this was the case with power meters when they first came out. It was like, okay, well, here's a number. What do you do with it, right? And with that, there was a little bit better understanding, because we had all these studies being done by smart people in universities. So the answer is no. There's not really a lot of advice, because aerodynamics is really tricky, especially with humans on bicycles, because as you can probably imagine, anytime you have anytime you change anything in terms of your position, your helmet, your clothing, it will very likely affect something downstream. So if we can imagine the rider traveling through air, or the air blowing past the rider, kind of this, depending on which perspective you take. If you change a helmet on this rider, that may change how the air flows over the back of the rider. Or if the rider changes her head position or her hand position, all of that, anything that's downstream from that is going to be affected. So it is very difficult to have a kind of a one size fits all solution. Say, okay, you all should pick your hands up and I'm talking about a straight up TT position or triathlon position. We should all be riding in the mantis position with high hands, or we should all be riding with narrow elbows, or we should all be wearing this brand of helmet, because it really does depend. It depends on our body sizes very much, because it depends on our velocities very much. A lot of this equipment is tested at 30 miles an hour in wind tunnels, and that's the published data. If you ever look at aerodynamic data from any manufacturer, it's usually at 30 miles an hour. But if you're a recreational triathlete and your race speed is 20 miles an hour, that's a totally different ball of wax. Like the way that the aeromath behaves, your Reynolds number at 20 miles an hour could be dramatically different than that the same physical human at 30 miles an hour. Or if you're now a bigger human or a smaller human, that everything changes. So right now there's definitely some understanding of, yes, this intervention or this body position tends to be faster than this other one. For example, it would be silly of me to say that, or trivial to say that if you're in the aero bars versus sitting up, you're going to be more aerodynamic, you're going to be faster in the aero bars. We all know that. There's no case that I'm aware of where sitting up on the brakes is going to be faster than being in the aero bars. But if we're starting to, make marginal gains differences, marginal gains tweaks, then there isn't a great understanding of, yes, this will be faster for all people, which is why testing is so valuable.
Yeah. Well, congratulations. You're officially part of Marginal Gains because you use the phrase, "it depends," which is a favorite of Josh's and any engineer with their salt.
Yep.
So congratulations. You are now a Marginal Gainer. I'm jumping around a little bit here, but what about yaw angles and, side winds and so forth? How do these makers deal with that? Can they deal with that? Or do you have to be very careful in those situations if you're testing?
Yeah, great question. So Noshio measures 0 degree yaw only, right? So there's only the one. There's the pitot tube, the aerodynamic sensor that's part of the Noshio device, can only measure 0 degree yaw airflow. So it does not understand if there's any kind of side wind, and that is a big limiting factor for it. Yeah. Because anytime you have, where do you get, other than indoors, where do you get zero yaw? Well, almost nowhere. So other devices, for example, I know Aerolab, Ghibli, and a few of the folks that are coming out with sensors, they are measuring non-zero yaw, and you want to measure it to at least 15 or 20 degrees. I think that's what folks like John Thornham at Flow have found, that almost all of the yaw encountered by cyclists, unless you're in a very, very windy conditions, is between plus and minus 20 degrees rather. So knowing that is critically important. And if you don't know that, if you cannot measure non-zero yaw, then your only solution is to repeat the experiment multiple times to try to smooth out any errors or any abnormal wind conditions. Mm-hmm. So that's a limiting factor that complicates your experimental design.
Mm-hmm. Let's move quickly then to stuff that does not require hardware. Just the Chung method, and which Marginal Gain listeners know about that fairly well here. What have you used or seen or coached with that doesn't involve the product that works pretty good or better than good? What do you like out there?
Yeah, so and I've mentioned them a couple of times, is this German company called Aerotune, and they have I feel one of the most robust systems out there, and they're actually coming out with a sensor this year. I believe it's this year. I hope I'm not, putting words in their mouth. But I know they are working on a sensor just to kind of complete their offering. They have probably the best, the most user-friendly system out there, and it's also super inexpensive. So for somebody who wants to play around with this stuff, the barrier for entry here is I think it's €30 a month, or maybe even €20 a month. I should really know this because I've used them. And you get, for that month, you can test an unlimited number of times. So rather than buying a $900 aero sensor, you can plunk down €20, I believe, and you can test as much as you want for a month. They obviously don't have a sensor yet, so the way they get around this not having a sensor problem is they will have you do this test, and that the test that I was describing earlier that had to be 1,400 meters long on a fairly flat road. This is their testing protocol. And so they will do out and backs, right? So the idea there is that provided that there's not a ton of variation in the wind from the time you go out to the time you come back, and provided you have the time to go to do several out and backs, and they say a minimum of 2 for each test setup, you can actually get some really good data. And the way you get that good data is because you're starting to smooth out the errors, right? So those little bumps that you get from a gust of wind, if you get a gust of wind on one of your passes, but you've done 6 passes, then the system can see that, okay, that was an abnormality, will ignore data from this gust of wind and still give you a very useful end result.
Mm-hmm. And have you been on the Chung method? I mean, we love the Chung method here. We prescribe it to people all the time. Say if you want to test something on your own, go out and use the Chung method. It seems to be a really good system for folks.
Yeah, it is. It is good. I haven't used it myself. I've read about it for sure, but it's not one that I am intimately familiar with. But I think, and I don't know this exactly because no one wants to share the secret sauce, but I think a lot of these Aerometers they basically use some version of the Chung method to do what they do. For example, Noshio for sure does, because they're at least their first generation where you had to import the fit file into Golden Cheetah and manipulate the virtual elevation. That's the Chung method, to a T. And all you had here was the only added bit that you had with the Noshio device was that you had 0 yaw aerospeed data as well, which modified the Chung method.
Well, let's circle back to this thing that I think kicked off this conversation, and that is, the hope that one day, hopefully, somehow, some way, we'll get beyond just the testing side, which sounds like, I think for a specific athlete, that sounds like something that could be explored, especially the triathlete who is very much engaged in, trying to get the most out of everything because they're all on their own out there and they need every advantage they get. But for really competitive, high-level cyclists, it might be an option there too. I think a time trialist, obviously, if they're really buried into testing and want to maximize everything, a no-show device or maybe an Aerolab device might be something for sure they want to explore. But to get beyond that and to get to, I think, a day when the Aero sensor is much like a power meter where all of us are using them or getting real-time data, give us your crystal ball here. What do you think? Can that happen? Will it happen? And how far out do you think we're looking?
So I don't see it becoming as ubiquitous as a power meter ever. Mostly because I think just most cyclists, they don't care as much. They don't care enough. Maybe that's kind of my read on the population. Most of us go out there just to enjoy riding their bikes, and we want to have a good time out there without complicating it with all of these devices. Because I cannot see a world where the technology, maybe, years down the line, where the technology is so robust that it can give you very useful information. One of the things, and sorry, I'm just going to take a very slight detour. One of the things that we talk about on Endurance Innovation whenever we are, faced with this question is we want to try to answer 2 questions. Like, does it work and is it useful? Right. So right now, these devices sort of work, I would say, and they are sort of useful. So in order for them to really work and to be really useful, they require quite a bit of external context. Like somebody who is an expert in this has to tell you what to do with it, which was an answer to your question earlier on. So to get them to work, I think we're going to get there, sooner rather than later, probably in the next 2 or 3 years. Will they be useful to the average cyclist? Probably not ever, because we're talking about not a huge difference in the enjoyment of riding a bike. But if you're racing, right, if your goal is from A to B as quickly as possible, then even right now they're useful, right? They're useful. You have to put in the work to make them useful, or you have to you either have to learn it yourself, or you have to pay somebody to do the learning, basically be the expert in the room for you. But they are definitely useful right now. So that's kind of a non-answer for you, Hadi, and I'm sorry, but that's where I land on that one.
No, we're full of non-answers here, and it depends.
Oh, that's right. Yes,
and,
it depends.
That's the nature of the show. So sometimes we're just evasive. That's fine. Hey, Marginal Gainers, this is the condensed version of what's going on with Aerometers and aerodynamics. If you want the full course, head over to the Endurance Innovation Podcast and listen to Michael and Andrew go on about this stuff. And they have more specific interviews and interviews with makers and companies who are pursuing this marginal gain. And I'd encourage you to go over there and give those shows a listen, along with all the other shows they have for triathletes and athletes and cyclists alike. And Michael, hey, thanks for joining us here on Marginal Gains. I hope one day we see our dream come true and we look down at our Garmin and there's a little CDA box down there and it's telling us, yeah, you're doing good right now. Congratulations. You're a 0.2 whatever. And
tuck your head.
Tuck your head and put on a better jersey, goddammit, and wear some shoe covers.
Yep, that's a dream. That's a dream.
Yeah.
Hadi, thank you so much for having me on. It's been a treat. It's always really fun to kind of switch the mic and have somebody else ask the questions, and then so that I can prattle on about this kind of stuff rather than get somebody else to do it.
Okay, we'll see you next time.
Thanks.